Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's session of the DuPage County ROE Online Professional Development Presentations. We are very pleased to today welcome Heather Staker from the InnoSight Institute, who is going to be talking to us about blended learning and some of the emerging models and how we might get started in this. I am Ray Rayberg. I'm the LTC Director here at the DuPage Regional Office of Education. Also online with us is Jeff Hunt, who is working with the ROE to coordinate these sessions. And without further ado then, I would like to introduce Heather and turn the presentation over to her. So thank you very much for joining us, Heather, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ray, and thank you to Jeff for the invitation. Alice, looks like you and I can have a little chat here until everyone else comes online. We'll go ahead and get started, but hopefully this can be interesting if it ends up just being you and me having a conversation about blended learning. So I'm really pleased to be here today and just to be talking a little bit about one of my passions, which is the emergence of K-12 blended learning models. And I began this work in May. Actually, in May we published a report that was about 200 pages of analysis of 40 different organizations that have started to engage in blended learning and are kind of the thought leaders in the space in terms of getting the most far along with their programs. And so we published that report in May. And subsequently, I've spent a lot of time tracking how blended learning is emerging across the country. And so that's what I'm here to share with you. I work at InnoSight Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank. We're based in the Bay Area. I'm actually talking to you from Austin, Texas. But our work is to explore disruptive innovation theory and how innovation can improve the delivery of education models in a more scalable and effective and predictable way. And so that's what we spend our time doing, is thinking about how innovation can improve education. I thought this was an interesting picture. This was taken by a photographer in Montana of a charter school, and the photographer titled it How Students Learn. And it's interesting to me to look at that and compare it to the high school that I attended. The contrast is quite striking, and I think that we can already eyeball some pretty significant differences between the way that certain students in schools now that are engaged in blended learning are digesting information as opposed to the way that we learned in a more traditional setup when I was in high school. So my question, and Alice, I won't put too much pressure on you since you and I are having a conversation right now together, but I was hoping to start by thinking with any participant about what the design would be of a student-centric system were we to have a blank slate and start over again and say, how are we going to piece together a system given that we can do anything we want to make this work for students? So if we didn't have any of the traditional constructs in mind and we were able to piece together a system that was entirely new, how would we make it student-centric? And I'm just going to close my chat window. There we go. So any thoughts that come to mind, and maybe Ray you'd want to jump in too, or Jeff, but any thoughts for features of what a student-centric system would look like? Were we to start from scratch and really design around customizing for the individual needs of each student and trying to help each student reach his or her maximum potential? How would you, what are some adjectives that you would think of that would describe that student-centric system?
Just checking that you can hear me, Heather.
Yes, hi, thank you.
Okay. You know, I was impressed just with the furniture.
In the picture
In the
before.
picture. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
No rows and desks and they can spread out and do their projects.
It's really different arrangement, huh?
And a very different
and I don't know how student-centric. Go ahead.
Very different way of approaching just the thought pattern of writing a lesson.
I agree with that. And you know, Jeff said dynamic. When I think of dynamic, I think of a system that can change quickly to respond to changing needs. Even individual students would have different preferences and different ways of pacing themselves and taking in information depending on their changing circumstances and complicated circumstances in their lives. So flexibility and dynamism, important criteria. So thinking about customization, the challenge with the traditional factory-style system that we've had since really the Industrial Revolution has been that it's highly interdependent, meaning that the different pieces of the system architecture are interrelated in a way that prohibits affordable customization. So that means that as we think about customizing for each student, it's cost prohibitive to try and make the system really different for each student. If we think about special education students and the cost of individual education plans, we realize quickly that that it's very expensive to customize when we have a system architecture that's highly interdependent. The interesting thing about online learning is that the internet is a technology enabler that potentially makes mass customization much more affordable. So if you think about other systems that are that have a technology enabler that allows for modularity, like perhaps the Android phone, you can imagine that system architecture makes a big difference for whether or not people can customize. My Android phone has the apps on it that I care about. Someone else's might be configured completely differently. Similarly, the internet allows for different ways of acquiring information, different paces for students to move along different pathways, for the curriculum to come to them in a way that matches their learning styles. And that's one of the interesting things about online learning, is that never before have we had an opportunity to achieve mass customization. Online learning is growing in a way that matches the pattern of a disruptive innovation, meaning that it's growing in a way that's similar to Android phones and other systems that have replaced complicated and highly integrated systems. Typically, disruptive innovations begin slowly as the entrepreneurs prototype and start to test the waters, and then suddenly the world flips and the curve becomes steep as new adopters replace old adopters, and the substitution rate is pretty steep. And then it eventually flattens out as the market becomes saturated. And using that calculation, we can anticipate that by 2019, 50% of high school courses will be online. It's quite a stunning prediction, but one that I think is starting to bear fruit. In fact, some of the analysts today are thinking that that prediction is quite conservative. In Michael Horn and Clayton Christensen's book, Disrupting Class, which was the precursor to InnoSight Institute and one of the grounding philosophies that we're based on, they predicted this 50% number, and in fact it's proving to be perhaps slightly conservative. So it's stunning to think how much the world is changing and will change in just the next few years. Where are we on the curve today? That's a good question. We're starting to be at that inflection point where it's flipping. So in 2000, there were 45,000 students approximately engaged in online learning or taking an online course. Today we anticipate that the number is, we're calculating that the number is between 3 and 5 million. Ambient Insight, a great research firm, has calculated or projected that by 2014 that number will jump to 10.5 million. So you can see the acceleration of the pace of that curve. So, so we just discussed that online learning is growing quickly. Indeed, 40 states have state-led online initiatives today. A lot of the growth is happening in districts, where districts are creating their own virtual schools or starting to engage in a blended program to bring online opportunities into their brick-and-mortar classrooms. The definition that we're using of blended learning, and we came at this by looking at those 40 operators in our report, and the real similarities is that all of them had students who were learning at least in part through online delivery with some element of student control over time, place, path, and or pace. And all of them were learning in a supervised brick and mortar place away from home. So it was those two key components, the online learning combined with the brick and mortar experience. Online learning began as largely a distance phenomenon, taking place mostly outside of the classroom remotely, students working at home. But if you think about it, it doesn't seem likely that that will continue. In fact, we expect that about 10% is the maximum number of students in the K-12 sector that will be able to ever learn completely remotely. Most don't have the home situation to support a homeschool environment or learning remotely, and they'll need to be learning at school. In fact, schools provide a lot of functionality, a lot of services besides just academic instruction. As we know, they also provide supervision and hot lunches and a lot of other good things. And so it makes sense that we see this migration of online learning as a distance phenomenon to online learning as a brick and mortar one. One note about blended learning is that oftentimes and increasingly I'm seeing that people conflate tech-rich learning with blended learning, and I think that that's a confusion that does a disservice to the movement. Just because the classroom might have an interactive smart board at the front of the room or even a one-to-one distribution of laptops or devices does not necessarily mean that it's blended. If you go back to that definition, one of the key parts of it is the idea that students have to learn at least with some control over time, place, path, and or pace. So the traditional system of a teacher controlling the pace and the time and the place and the path, even with a lot of technology behind him or her, still does not necessarily constitute a blended learning environment. So looking at the landscape for blended learning, in the original report we identified 6 models that are emerging as blended learning. We're in the process right now of refining that taxonomy, and in the next few weeks we will publish an updated, very short white paper that suggests that we can clump those categories into 4. And part of the thinking there is that we're hoping to broaden and loosen the categories a little bit to allow more people to find a category that seems to reflect what they're doing. The 6 categorization, 6 model scheme was really tight. So the 4 was a little bit looser, and I think hopefully will make better sense of this universe that's emerging. And Alice, or if any of you has a suggestion for any ways to improve the taxonomy, I'd really appreciate it, because we're very much in the midst of thinking it through right now and would love any feedback. So let me just tell you our most current thinking right now for how the models seem to be taking shape. The first model that I'll tell you about is the rotation model. And this is any time that students within a course are moving on a fixed schedule between online learning and some other station. So for example, there's the station rotation model, where there are 2 or more stations in the classroom. So students are rotating between online learning, a teacher-led station with a small group, and then perhaps another station with projects or worksheets or some other, or independent learning or something of that sort. An example is KIPP LA's Empower Academy, where students rotate on a fixed schedule among these 3 stations. And the beauty of it is that for the teacher-led instruction portion, the teacher can adapt to the individual needs of a cluster of students as opposed to trying to teach all 30 or so students at the same time. KIPP LA has had some interesting and promising results. They've been able to increase their student-teacher ratio to 28:1 instead of 20:1, which is helpful in a time of budget constraints. And by the end of year 1, these are all kindergarten students in their first pilot, but 96% of students were proficient in reading compared to just 9% at the beginning of the year. The next model is the lab rotation model. This is another version of rotation, but specifically with this model, instead of rotating among stations in a classroom, we're seeing that for some schools, the students are rotating out of the classroom for a learning lab or a block of time into a room where they engage in online learning, and perhaps they're supervised by a paraprofessional instead of a teacher, and then they rotate back to their classrooms for the direct instruction portion. An example is Rocket Ship Education, which gets a lot of acclaim these days. They are grades K through 5. There are about 1,300 students. They're located in San Jose, California. And in terms of results, the schools, the rocket ships are among the top 15 for academic performance among low-income schools in California. And the other interesting thing about rocket ship is because of the use of this learning lab, they're able to save $500,000 approximately per year, which they reinvest in other parts of their model, like better teacher salaries and teacher training. So they've been able to reallocate some of their traditional expenditures for things that they consider to be higher impact. The third rotation model to suggest is the classroom rotation model, and that's where within the classroom the entire cohort of students rotates between online learning, and then they put that down and they do something else. In this case, with Summit Public Schools, they engage in these really rich challenge projects that are based on the things that they've been learning online. Summit Public Schools is based in Redwood City, California. They serve grades 9 through 12, and they've partnered with Khan Academy. They do this classroom rotation just for math. And so basically, Khan Academy provides the math online learning portion, and then they do the challenge project for the other part of their rotation. And in 2011, Newsweek named Summit Prep one of America's top 10 miracle high schools. So far it's getting rave reviews for this classroom rotation model. So those are 3 examples of the rotation model. Moving on to the next model, the flex model. This is another version of blended learning that we're seeing is starting to creep up. This one is a little bit more complicated to implement. So whereas the rotation model doesn't require a massive rethinking of facilities or the way that the facilities are laid out, nor does it require typically a reconstruction of teacher contracts. The flex model represents a greater departure, and oftentimes it implicates teacher contracts and facility design and that type of thing. So it's not as common yet, with the caveat being that a lot of districts are using the flex model for dropout students, who where they set up a flex lab, perhaps even in a shopping mall or somewhere close to where the students are working, so that to make it extra convenient. And oftentimes the hours are like 24 hours a day. Students can come in for just a few hours at a time and engage in online learning with supervised support, teacher support, face-to-face, but in a very non-traditional environment. So here's an example of how the flex model might work. And this is taken from Carpe Diem Collegiate High School and Middle School in Yuma, Arizona. The way that their school is set up is you walk in and there's a big learning lab in the center of the school. It's almost like a call center. And it can house actually up to 300 students that each have their own workstation, and they engage in online learning powered by E2020. And then around the periphery of the room, there are online learning stations and direct instruction stations. So the teachers pull students out for tutoring, for seminars, for small group instruction, for small group projects, to supplement and provide as-needed support for the online learning. Carpe Diem has also received a lot of acclaim. They were named by U.S. News & World Report as one of 2010 top high schools in America, and they also ranked first in their county in math and reading scores. And this is in a population that's characterized by high numbers of free and reduced lunch students and a lot of needs. So this has been an interesting model that they've carved out in Yuma, Arizona. And this flex model, what it does is it allows students to work at their own pace in the learning lab or in their workstations, and then it allows teachers to pull the students out and meet their needs on a one-to-one or small group basis. Carpe Diem actually only has 6 full-time teachers for the 273 students. It also has some paraprofessionals. But those 6 teachers, one for English language arts, one for math, one for science, and so forth, are able to give one-to-one instructions to students because of this learning lab model. The next model is the self-blend. This is the most prevalent model, as a matter of fact, and it's where anytime that a student takes an online course or more than one online course, while also attending a brick-and-mortar school. So perhaps a student wants to take AP Calculus, and that's not available at their school. They might just choose to take that course to Florida Virtual School on their own, and then take the rest of their courses at their traditional high school. or maybe because of scheduling complications, they can't fit that course into their schedule, and so they take it on their own at night. Maybe they're taking courses, maybe they're taking a Spanish course in the Learning Lab on campus, but it's a standalone course, completely self-contained online course without the face-to-face help that we see in these flex and rotation models. And that's the self-blend. It's growing rapidly because it's pretty easy to implement. All that needs to happen is the district needs to say, we will accept those credits, and in many cases, states are starting to pay for those courses to allow students the access to coursework that otherwise wouldn't fit in their schedule, or that for whatever other reason they prefer to engage in online. I thought it might be fun, and I know we only have a couple of minutes here, but I wanted to show you a little bit, like if we could turn the camera around so you could actually see what that girl was looking at. What do these online courses look like? Well, first comment is that there is an absolute proliferation of content options. In the 40 programs that I profiled in the Rise of Blended Learning report, this is a diagram of the content companies that were cited. And so there is a real fragmentation of the market. We expect it to consolidate to some extent, but for now there are truly a plethora of providers in the online content space, which begs the question of how to choose the right ones. To some extent, the self-learned students are choosing themselves based on the word of mouth and marketing materials that they get from these content providers. Here's an example from Connections Learning. They were recently acquired by Pearson, but just to give you a view of what a biology course might look like, with Connections they have this virtual microscope lab. And the microscope allows you to change the views on it, just switch slides out. It's very interactive. So that's an example of what a virtual microscope might look like in an online biology lab. Virtual high school, here's a lesson that they provide about joints. And so you see that the lesson begins with a text-based introduction. It might then have a video or some other way of conveying the main body of knowledge about joints, and then they ask students to step away from their screen and actually build a cartilaginous joint, take a picture of it, and write a blog. So here's an example of the work that one student did based on the lesson they just had about joints, to then try and make it real to them and blog about it. So online courses don't always mean just completely being glued to the screen. Oftentimes there are dimensions of it that allow for stepping away from the screen and doing other types of projects. This is from Dreambox Learning. I like Dreambox because my daughter has had such great success with Dreambox. She did a bunch of Dreambox over the summer, and Dreambox focuses on virtual manipulatives. So it has online abacuses and online number lines and those sort of things. My daughter then, when we were at IKEA, found an abacus, and I was interested to see that she was really easily able to translate what she had done virtually to the tangible world. And she was showing me different ways of making the number 50 using this abacus, and I was just fascinated to see that translation from virtual to physical happened quite easily for her. I don't know if that's typical or not. Here's Mind Research's SP Math. Its premise is that for some students, text gets in the way of math acquisition. And so they have tried to eradicate text completely from their programming to allow students to absorb the information and progress with their math, even if they're challenged by lots of words on the page. So this would be an example of a problem that a student might see. I'll show you how you solve this. So I'll forget, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I'm going to show you, unless Ray, you want to take a stab at telling me how to do this, I'm going to give you a little web version here. See if that shows up. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if anyone wants to take a guess at what you push first, in the interest of time, I'll just show you, but I had to experiment with this a little bit. So this is all that was given to the student. They have to figure out that what you would do is you'd first select that, then you'd select that again, then you'd rotate little penguin to the right, and here's what happens. You can see I got it right. So those would be the type of games that would be available on STMS. The point being that different students learn in different ways, and that for some students removing the text is a huge indicates of removal of a huge barrier to learning math. And so with the proliferation of content, we can imagine that there will be a lot of variety to allow students to access concepts in a way that will be speediest and most effective for them. So that's one of the attractions to the online learning possibilities. Then the fourth model is the remote model, and that's anytime. This is one that I'm still playing with a little bit for the taxonomy, so if you have any feedback for whether or not this model seems to be congruent with what you're seeing with the emergence of blended learning. But something to the effect of a remote model where students are untethered from the classroom and they're doing some of their learning online, away from class, and some of it in the classroom. And so, let's see, if I have time, I will show you a quick clip of how mobile devices are quickly changing the way that students access content. So here's an example for the remote model.
You're late to your morning climb, but you have a few things left to study. Remember that discussion thread on dark matter? It's right there. Or that visualization of the double helix? It's there too. Announcements, discussion forums, all your homework assignments, even the name that cute girl from class. It's all right there. And after all those hours of studying on the go, what you're looking for is right there.
So that's an example of how mobile devices are changing digital learning. It's not necessarily blended learning in that example, because it looks like that's an example of a text device that's facilitating a traditional classroom, but I still wanted to show it to you just as an example of how mobile devices are quickly improving and allowing for the possibility of a remote model to emerge. So those are the four models that we're seeing. Again, I'd really welcome any, I'm going to set my email up here. I'd really welcome any feedback about whether you see anomalies to these models, because if you're seeing blended learning modules that don't fit into one of these, it would be very helpful to me as we try and find a more accurate taxonomy. And hopefully, and I'm sure that as this field continues to mature, that we will see a proliferation of other models that are not depicted here. But this is just a flavor of some of the main categories that we're starting to see. The final caveat, and on the final minute, is that not all content and implementations are equal. Indeed, there are things that educators need to think about to ensure that blended learning is happening in the best way possible. First is to begin at the end, define the outcomes that you seek, and then work towards those. In the same vein, make technology the space to your strategy, not the other way around. We know a lot of things about how students learn most successfully. And oftentimes we get so excited about the technology that we have that be the main fundamental of the program, as opposed to thinking about what we know in terms of how students need good teachers and students need good relationships and lots of other things about how students learn best. And then we use technology to facilitate those things, and it needs to stay that way. Another thought is to personalize for your own circumstances. Think in terms of SWOT, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So as schools start to think about how to best bring blended learning in for their students, thinking about your individual circumstances and how to customize for those, as well as customize for the students themselves to drive that real student personalization aspect to the program. And then we just talked about rapidly improving communication tools. Illuminate, Blackboard, Skype. These didn't even exist recently, until very recently. And so we're seeing that as communication and content both improve, the hopes of online learning also improving are pretty great. And then finally, shift to outcome accountability, not input-based rules. So doing away with traditional ideas of student-teacher ratios and teacher certifications and some of the things that could constrain innovation, as opposed to opening it up with the caveat that holding schools accountable for the results, so that there's plenty of room to innovate. And those are my thoughts. So thank you very much for joining today in our small and intimate discussion. And you have my email, Alice, so if there's anything I can do, I'd love to be a resource to you.
Heather, we did have a question earlier when you put up the slide showing the growth towards 50% for online learning by 2019.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question posted as, where do you think we are on that curve right now?
Yes, so right now we're at about 3 to 5 million students that are taking online courses. The numbers are showing that we're slightly ahead of that projection, so such that we might hit the 50% number before 2019. So I think we're somewhere starting to climb that steeper portion of the curve right now. With certainly a ton of growth ahead of us in the next few years, but the numbers are bearing out to show that it looks like we are indeed sloping in a way that would indicate that we're on target to hit that 2019 number.
Thank you. And then a follow-up question I had was, you said that you saw it flattening out, the curve flattening out at that point. Then where do you anticipate it might top out at? What percentage?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I think that that the 50% number is probably starting to get to a point where we're seeing a wide adoption rate. But in terms of, so the idea isn't, my thought is that not all students will be taking online courses. But that I do think we're seeing lots of indicators that the system will allow for differentiation in a way that it hasn't in the past. And so for those students where online learning works, it will increasingly become an option. Some students will continue to learn entirely pencil and paper because that works best for them. So it's not that necessarily the whole world will move online, it's just that for those students where it works the best to study online, or at least for certain courses or certain concepts, the indicators are pointing to a world that will more readily accommodate that than it does right now.
Okay. Thank you. And once again, Heather, thank you very much for leading this discussion today. I know I personally gained a lot of information and knowledge from your presentation. I'd like to just remind our participants that next Tuesday, February 14th, our presenter will be Catherine Francis from K12.com, and she will be discussing curriculum materials. And with that, I am going to stop the recording.
Thanks, Rick.